He raised his rifle, ready to end a stranger's life, until 6 words shattered everything he believed about mercy, war, and love. What followed wasn't just survival. It was a journey of healing rebellion and the quiet kind of courage that could change a soul. Stay with us because this story will break your heart, then stitch it back together in ways you never expected. The first time Gideon Rourke laid eyes on her, the desert had been silent for hours, but in that moment it screamed. There are some places where time refuses to move forward, where the world holds its breath and waits for something terrible or miraculous to happen. Just outside the ghost town of Ruth, Nevada, as the last bruised light of dusk slipped behind the mountains, Gideon found such a place, and in it he found her. She was standing alone among the dying shadows, no more than a ghost herself. Her figure, half shrouded by a brittle stand of mesquite, she looked like she'd been carved from the desert, sun-bleached, wind-chiseled, and barely clinging to life. Her feet were raw. Her dress was torn. Her face held no tears, no hope, only a kind of steady defiance that unnerved even a man like Gideon Rourke. He raised his revolver by instinct. In his world, hesitation could get you killed, and compassion was a luxury that didn't belong to men who'd seen too much. He had ended lives for less than a wrong glance. This, whatever this wasn't going to be different. Until she spoke. "Please don't hurt me," she said. Her voice was more breath than sound, like the wind scratching through an empty canyon. Then she added, "If you don't, I can give you life." Gideon didn't understand at first. Was it a trick, a plea, a warning? But she didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't beg. There was no seduction in her voice, no trembling desperation, only something flat and hollow like she'd spoken those words 100 times before, and no longer knew what they meant. It stopped him cold, and that terrified him. He'd fought in wars, hunted dangerous men through salt flats and badlands, tracked killers who left nothing but broken things behind them. But nothing ever cracked open the shell around his heart quite like the look in this woman's eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't strength. It was something older, deeper. It was surrender not to him, but to the cruelty of the world. Gideon lowered his gun. They stood there for what felt like forever, 2 strangers bound by silence. The air between them hung heavy, as if even the wind didn't dare intrude. He stepped closer slowly, like approaching a wounded animal that had forgotten how to trust. Her legs wobbled. Her lips were cracked. Her hands clutched a small pouch tied at her waist, the only thing on her that looked cared for. "What's your name?" he asked. "Luma." The way she said it made it sound like a memory. He didn't offer his own. Instead, he uncorked his canteen and held it out. She took it with both hands, though her fingers trembled so badly she spilled half the water down her front. He didn't speak. He didn't help. He just watched. Luma drank like someone who wasn't sure she was allowed to. When she finished, she handed the canteen back without meeting his eyes. He should have left her there. That would have been the smart thing. But Gideon Rourke hadn't done the smart thing in years. He'd been wandering through the desert for weeks now, trying to outrun ghosts that never tired with nothing but a horse and the weight of his past strapped to his back. Something in Luma's presence, so quiet, so final, felt like a mirror, or maybe a warning. He turned his horse east and gave a subtle nod. If she could walk, she could follow. She limped after him. No complaints, no questions, just grit and silence. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask. They made camp beneath a shelf of rock, the sky above them swollen with stars. The fire Gideon built was small more for ritual than warmth. He handed her a strip of jerky from his saddlebag, and she took it without thanks. She chewed slowly, painfully. It sounded like gravel between her teeth. He studied her in the flickering light, how her hair curled with dust, how the lines at the corners of her mouth weren't from age but from holding back words. "I was taken," she said quietly, "by men who thought the desert could swallow what they did." Gideon didn't ask who. He already knew the type. "I ran for 3 days, hid in a ravine, ate cactus, slept in fear. When you found me, I didn't know if you'd be better or worse. So I gave you the only thing I had left." She wasn't talking about her body. She wasn't talking about survival either. She was talking about the last ember of hope that hadn't gone out. He nodded once. Not out of understanding, but respect. There were no words that could answer what she'd just said. As the fire crackled, she unrolled a blanket more thread than fabric and lay down with her back to him. Gideon stayed seated, his revolver resting on his knee eyes, scanning the darkness. It wasn't that he didn't trust her. It was that something in the night still felt unfinished, like this story wasn't ready to rest. Hours passed. Wind shifted. Coyotes howled in the far distance. Luma didn't stir. And Gideon Rourke, gunfighter, ex-soldier loner by choice, found himself listening not for danger, but for the rhythm of her breathing. There was something in that sound that settled in his bones. Not peace, not yet, but maybe the first step toward it. In the hours just before dawn, as the horizon peeled open in delicate shades of blue and silver, Gideon led his horse up a narrow ridge above the desert floor. Luma rode in the saddle. Her head leaned against the animal's neck, her eyes half shut, not from sleep, but from something quieter, pain maybe, or memory. Gideon didn't ask, he just walked. They passed through the skeletal remains of old homesteads, places where dreams once took root, but didn't hold. Crumbling walls, rusted windmills, a single boot buried in the sand. There was a stillness in the world that morning, the kind that felt earned, not given. Somewhere out in the hush, birds began to sing. That surprised him. Life like that, delicate and defiant, had no right surviving in a place so dry and old. By midday, they reached a canyon thick with cedar trees. A rare place, the kind most folks would miss unless they were looking for it or had been led there. Gideon wasn't sure which it was. Luma lifted her head. "Here," she said. They stopped in a clearing where the trees broke just wide enough for light to pour down in warm stripes. She dismounted with effort, favoring her bad ankle. Gideon steadied her this time, without hesitation. She didn't pull away. The air smelled different here. Resin soil, something green. It smelled like a memory that hadn't been tainted. Luma knelt near the roots of a cedar. Her fingers brushed aside dirt, her movements sure. She dug up a small plant with purple blossoms, crushed the leaves in her palm, and applied them to her ankle. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "Medicine, the old kind. Stronger than anything you'll find bottled. You a healer?" She nodded. "Used to be, before they took that for me." He didn't push for more. They rested in that grove for the remainder of the day. Gideon patched the saddle, checked the rifle. Luma collected herbs and dried them on a flat rock. She moved slower now, but with purpose, as if in this one quiet patch of earth she was reclaiming something lost. Late in the afternoon she motioned for him to sit. "Give me your hands," she said. He hesitated, then obeyed. She examined his knuckles, the scars. "You hold your fists too long, even when you're not fighting. I don't know any other way." She smiled, not with joy, but recognition. "You can learn," she said. She wrapped a strip of cloth around his palm. Not for injury, for grounding. A gesture of healing that spoke louder than words. As the sun dipped low, Gideon watched her prepare tea from cedar needles and desert mint. She offered him a cup. It was bitter and strange, but it warmed him all the same. "You trust me?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I believe you're trying." She told him about her mother that evening, how she used to sing as she mixed herbs, as if every blend were a prayer. She told him about the first time she healed someone with just plants and touched a boy from her village who'd stepped on a rusted nail. That had been the day she felt the land speak to her, she said, and it hadn't spoken since the day she was taken. Gideon shared his silence in return. He didn't speak of war or blood or how many nights he'd laid awake begging for a past he couldn't undo. But he listened, and in that listening offered his own kind of story. That night a wind picked up in the trees. It sounded almost like laughter or grief. Luma curled up by the fire with her pouch of herbs under her head like a pillow. Gideon stayed up a little longer, watching the branches sway above them. There was no moon, but the stars blinked stubbornly like they refused to go out. Somewhere out in the dark an owl hooted. It felt like a benediction. He turned to her sleeping form and whispered, not loud enough for her to hear, but for himself, "You brought me here for a reason, didn't you?" The trees didn't answer, but they didn't deny it either. And in the morning, when she stirred before the sun and lit a small bundle of sage to cleanse the space, he didn't flinch from the smoke. He sat beside her, hands open, palms up, ready to learn something new. As they packed their things that morning, Luma placed a tiny sprig of cedar in Gideon's coat pocket. She didn't explain and he didn't ask, but when he touched it later, something about its scent steadied him. They didn't speak much as they left the grove, walking deeper into the wilderness, but their silence was no longer jagged. It was rounded like river stones worn by time and water, and the mutual weight of things left unsaid. By midday, they came upon a dry riverbed carved deep into the canyon floor. Luma pointed out animal tracks, deer, rabbit, even mountain lion. Her eyes, dull with fatigue, just days before, were alive with recognition. She wasn't just moving through the land anymore. She was reading it. She knelt by a flat rock and placed her hands on it gently. My people used to call this place Breath Hollow. They believed the wind here carried voices. Gideon crouched beside her. Voices of who ancestors? Spirits. People who once stood where we are now. He looked out across the ravine, feeling the air shift. It didn't seem like superstition. Not here. Not with her. And when she began humming again that same melody from the night before, he didn't just hear it. He felt it. In his chest. In his bones. It wasn't a song for entertainment. It was a song for remembering. That night, as they camped again beneath a cliff's overhang, Luma traced symbols into the dirt with a stick. She explained none of them, but Gideon watched each line as if it held the answer to questions he hadn't yet asked. Before sleep took them, she said, "We're not alone, even when we think we are." And in that moment, Gideon Rourke began to believe she might be right. The cedar grove faded behind them, but something from it lingered inside them both. The night the girl appeared, the wind had teeth. It tore through the canyon with a voice full of sorrow and warning. The fire Gideon built flickered like it wanted to vanish, and the sky stretched above them like a blanket ready to be pulled away. Luma had just curled up with her herb pouch under her head. Gideon sat nearby, one hand resting near the rifle, the other turning the cedar sprig she'd tucked into his coat pocket. He wasn't praying. Not exactly. But he was listening for animals, for ghosts, for the past trying to claw its way back. Then came the footsteps. Not loud, not hurried, just enough to turn instinct into steel. He rose slowly, heart-shifting gears, without asking his permission. A shadow stumbled out of the darkness beyond the trees, small, thin limping. Gideon lifted the rifle, but didn't aim it, not yet. "Please," a voice croaked, cracking in the middle. "Please, help me." She couldn't have been older than 14. Filthy barefoot, her dress torn in too many places to count. Mud and blood covered her legs. Her hair was tangled like it had grown wild around her. In one hand, she clutched something tight against her chest. At first, Gideon thought it was a weapon. It was a notebook. Luma stirred behind him. The girl saw her, flinched, but didn't run. The girl tried again. Her knees buckled. Gideon moved fast, caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin was burning. They laid her near the fire, wrapped her in a blanket. Luma worked quickly, checking her pulse, whispering things under her breath. Words Gideon didn't understand, but they soothed the air. Hours passed before the girl opened her eyes again. Her name was Mira. She told them little at first, only that she had escaped, that the men she ran from were still looking for her, that if they found her she wouldn't be the one to suffer alone. She didn't cry, not once, but the way she held that notebook told Gideon everything he needed to know. Whatever was in it, it was her shield, her proof, her story. Later that night, while Luma brewed tea and Gideon sharpened a stick to reinforce the tent frame, Mira sat up slowly and opened the book. She didn't speak, just showed them page after page of drawings, people with scars, dogs with red mouths, trucks with broken windows, faces of men with cruel eyes, symbols Gideon didn't recognize, barbed wire over hearts, shackles around shadows. Then one face made Luma freeze. She reached forward and gently touched the page. "You've seen this man." Mira nodded. "I saw him. Smile when my brother was shot." That was the first time she said the word brother. Luma sat beside her, gently brushing hair from the girl's cheek. "You're safe now." But they all knew the truth. Safety was a temporary illusion out here. What they could offer was sanctuary for a night, maybe more. But the kind of men chasing Mira didn't let loose ends live. As the fire burned down to coals, Mira spoke again, this time with more weight in her voice. "They sold us, called us cargo, said no one would come looking." Gideon felt the air leave his lungs. He'd seen darkness before. But this was different. This wasn't war. It was commerce in pain. Luma asked no more questions. She simply offered a cup of tea. Mira sipped, wincing, and leaned against her. Not quite trust, but not resistance either. The next morning, Gideon woke to the sound of soft scratching. Mira was drawing again, this time in the dirt beside the fire. Circles, stars, arrows pointing nowhere. A map, maybe, or a prayer. He sat beside her. "You an artist?" She shrugged. "I draw what I remember, so I don't forget." He nodded. "You're doing more than remembering. You're surviving." She looked up at him. Her eyes weren't broken. They were sharp, searching. "Will they find me?" Gideon glanced toward the horizon. "Not while I've got a say." That day, they didn't move. They stayed put, gathering strength. Gideon taught Mira how to listen for movement, how to read the wind. Luma made salves for her blisters, braided her hair with wild lavender. At sunset, Mira handed Gideon a torn scrap of paper. On it was a drawing of him. Stern, face-tired eyes, but there was something different in the sketch, a softness in the lines, a hint of peace. "You didn't make me look scary," he said. "You're not," she answered. That night, as stars returned to their silent vigil, Luma sang. Mira leaned into her, and Gideon sat close by, not guarding, just being. It was then he realized the girl hadn't just stumbled into their camp. She had been led by the same quiet thread of fate that had pulled Luma from the ashes, that had forced Gideon to lower his gun. They weren't saving Mira. She was saving something in them. And as she drifted to sleep, her fingers still holding tight to that battered notebook, Gideon whispered to no one, "Let them come. We're not who we were yesterday. The signs arrived quietly, like warnings wrapped in fog, a set of boot prints near the creek bed. A rabbit snared and left untouched, smoke on the wind that didn't belong to their fire. Mira noticed first. She had grown used to watching the margins of the world. Her drawings changed more jagged lines, darker tones. The men who hunted her were close. Luma saw it in her eyes. Gideon felt it in his gut. The old instinct born of war and sharpened by survival whispered in his bones. It was time to decide. Run again, or stand. The question hung between them that evening as they huddled by a low-burning fire. The sky above was streaked with gold, but beneath the trees the light felt like it was slipping away faster than usual. "We can't keep moving," Gideon said. His voice was steady, but there was a weight in it, a finality. "They'll find us no matter where we go," Luma replied. She wasn't afraid, just tired. Mira looked between them, then said something neither expected. "I don't want to run anymore." Her voice trembled, but the message didn't. Gideon nodded slowly. That settled it. They found shelter in a weather-beaten barn nestled against a rock outcrop near Antelope Valley. It had no doors, just a heavy plank they could drag across the entrance. No windows, but narrow slits in the walls let light filter in like ghost fingers. For the next 2 days, they prepared. They reinforced the barn with what little they had, dug a shallow trench to hide in if the worst came. Luma packed herbs into cloth pouches, binding them tight with twine medicinal and spiritual. Mira helped gather stones to circle the fire, her hands calloused but determined. Gideon carved new stakes from fallen branches and set them in the ground around the barn, not as weapons, but as boundary markers. Not a fence, he told Mira, a promise. She nodded. She understood. She was drawing again, this time on the walls of the barn, not shadows, not pain, but circles, spiral stars, symbols of protection. Her hands shook as she worked, but her focus never wavered. Then came the travelers. They appeared one by one like echoes, answering a call that hadn't been spoken aloud. A young couple Gideon once helped dig a well. An old rancher who'd lost his son and found his voice again after Luma sang for his grief. A preacher with a crooked spine and a sharper faith. They came with lanterns, blankets, and stories of kindness returned. They didn't ask questions. They saw Mira, saw the look in Gideon's eyes, and they chose. They stayed. Some built makeshift barricades with scrap lumber. Others stood watch in Schiff's eyes, always on the horizon. They didn't come as warriors, but as guardians of something larger than themselves, a child, a chance, a change. They didn't speak of heroism. They simply acted. When the trucks came, the earth itself seemed to brace. The engines rumbled over the ridge, their black shapes outlined against the dying sun. Gideon stood in front of the barn, unarmed, his rifle laid on the ground beside him. Luma was to his right, Mira to his left. The others formed a wide crescent behind them, silent and still. The man who stepped out first had a scar that cut across his jaw like lightning. His boots were too clean, his eyes too still. "You know who I am," he said. Gideon didn't blink. "Doesn't matter. She belongs to us." "No," Luma said calmly. "She belongs to no one." The scarred man looked past them to Mira. "You want to come willingly?" Mira shook her head. "I'm not afraid of you." He smiled then, or tried to. It didn't reach his eyes. "You should be." "You don't scare her," Gideon said. "Not anymore." The wind shifted. Somewhere behind them, the preacher stepped forward. He held up a Bible in one hand, a lantern in the other. "If you mean to hurt this child," he said, "you'll have to do it in the light." That's when the scarred man hesitated. One by one, the people behind Gideon stepped closer. No weapons. Just presence. Just will. The sound of nothing was louder than thunder. "This is your stand?" the scarred man asked. Gideon nodded. "We don't fight the way you do. We hold the line." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with breath, with memory, with conviction. The scarred man cursed under his breath. "Let's go." And just like that, the trucks turned. The dust rose behind them and then was gone. The quiet that fell afterward was the kind that could break a person or mend them. Mira collapsed to her knees, not from fear, but from release. Luma knelt beside her. Gideon closed his eyes. The others slowly sat or knelt in the dirt, not because they were tired, but because they understood what they had done together. No blood had been shed, no guns fired, but they had won. That night the barn glowed with more than firelight. It glowed with the warmth of those who stayed. They passed around breadwater stories. Mira sang a song her brother used to hum. It cracked halfway through, but no one interrupted. They simply listened. Luma placed a circle of stones around the fire, whispering a blessing. Gideon sat still beside her, the carved wooden sparrow he'd once given Mira resting in her hands. She looked at it, then looked at him. 1,000 words passed in a single glance, and in that barn, old, broken, imperfect, they were something more than survivors. They were a family remade by choice, and as the stars turned above them, no longer distant but near, Gideon whispered a promise he never thought he'd speak again. "You're safe now, because we chose to be the wall." And for the first time in years, silence did not mean danger, it meant peace. The rain came hard that night, drumming on the old roof of the barn like 1,000 knuckles knocking at once. Gideon didn't sleep. He sat at the threshold watching the rain slash through the dark. Not long ago, a storm like this would have felt like an omen, but now it felt like a cleansing. A curtain being pulled across one chapter to reveal another. When morning came, the land looked different. The dust had settled. The air smelled of sage and mud. Sunlight broke through the clouds like a promise. It didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like rebirth. They didn't speak of the night before. They didn't need to. The fire that had nearly come to their doorstep had passed, and in its wake something unexplainable remained. Not relief, but a sense of rootedness, like the world had paused to acknowledge them. The girl had been saved. But so had they. The barn weathered, and old didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt like the beginning of something whole. They didn't pack up to leave. They stayed. That choice came slowly in gestures rather than declarations. Mira began clearing a patch of earth near the edge of the barn. Gideon found seeds in an old tin someone left behind. Luma hung her herbs by the rafters, letting the scent of wild mint and yarrow drift through the air. The barn became something else, no longer a place to hide, but a place to grow, a place to belong. Mira asked Gideon if she could paint. Not on paper this time, but on the wood itself. He nodded, and with a mix of ash berry juice and clay, she began etching scenes along the walls. Her brother's smile, a hand reaching through fire, a circle of stones, a tree with the roots so long they stretched to the bottom of the boards. Each stroke felt like breath returning to lungs long collapsed. Each image a vow to never forget. Luma tended to the soil. She taught Mira how to press seeds into the earth with reverence, not force. We don't command the land, she told her. We ask, and we listen. Gideon built a fence, not to keep people out, but to hold a space sacred. He carved new posts from cedar branches, setting them evenly around the garden. On each one he etched a different word: hope, memory, return, protect, begin. And over time those words rooted deeper than the posts themselves. The rhythm of days slowed, then settled. Mornings were for work, afternoons for stories. Evenings, they sat close by the fire as Mira read aloud from a journal they found tucked into the barn's loft. It had belonged to the man who once lived there, a widower who spent years writing to the wife he'd lost. Each entry a whisper into the past, each word a reminder that love endures. Gideon, hardened by years of silence, found himself moved. Not by the sorrow, but by the act of keeping someone alive through memory. He began carving again, not just birds, but cradles, bowls, things that could be used passed down. One afternoon they heard footsteps again, not hurried, not loud, just careful. It was the old preacher carrying a small box filled with cloth-dried beans and a letter. "This is from the townsfolk," he said. "We figured you might want to stay a while longer." Gideon looked to Luma, who looked to Mira. No one spoke, but they all smiled. The days turned to weeks. The garden grew. The wild rose climbed along the barn walls. Birds nested in the eaves. Strangers passed by, travelers, lost boys, broken women, and some stayed if only for a night. Some left pieces of themselves behind a shawl, a story, a prayer carved into bark. The place earned a name. Not from them, but from those who visited. The Quiet Circle. And it was not just a name, it was a way of being. A place where people didn't have to run. Where they were allowed to stop, to listen, to be seen. One morning, Gideon found Mira standing by the fence. Her hair had grown longer, her face fuller. She was humming. Not the sad melody of before, but something new, something soft. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That we made it," she said, "even if only for a while." He looked out at the field beyond where the grass now danced in the breeze like it had always belonged. "That's enough," he replied. That night, Luma prepared a stew from what they'd grown. They ate, slowly passed bread and told stories, not of what they'd lost, but what they remembered with gratitude. They spoke of trees they climbed as children, songs their parents used to sing the feel of rain on summer skin. Gideon shared a story from his war days, not of killing, but of saving a comrade with nothing but a word. Luma shared a tale of her grandmother who once turned a dry riverbed into a healing garden. When the fire burned low and the stars blinked overhead, Mira took Gideon's hand. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe. But next time they'll see what we've built. And that'll be enough to make them think twice." Luma reached for the wooden wolf he'd once carved. She placed it at the garden's edge, facing outward. "A guardian," she said. They slept soundly that night for the first time, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Not because the world had changed, but because they had. And in the heart of the desert where nothing was meant to last, something finally had. The fire still crackled, the earth still turned. But in this small sacred place a garden had grown from ash, and it would remain long after the last word was spoken. Gideon, Luma, and Mira began as scattered souls bound by loss. A former soldier broken by war. A healer exiled from her people. A child marked by cruelty. Their meeting in the unforgiving wilderness was not fate, it was survival. But what they built together, what rose from the cracked earth and silent nights, was something far more powerful than chance. It was a choice. A steady, relentless, deliberate choice to live differently. From the moment Gideon lowered his rifle and chose not to pull the trigger, the trajectory of their lives shifted. He had spent years believing that strength came from solitude, that trust was a luxury afforded only to the naive. But in Luma's quiet resilience, he saw a new kind of strength, one that didn't need to raise its voice. And in Mira's fragile defiance, he recognized his own lost innocence. Luma, too, had learned to trust again, not in systems or symbols, but in people. She had been stolen from her roots, from her community, but never from her spirit. Her rituals, her connection to the land, and her unwavering presence became the foundation of a home they didn't plan to build. A home where hands worked soil, not just to eat, but to remember. Where each herb hung to dry carried a whisper of survival and healing. And Mira, the girl who had once spoken only through charcoal and pain, found her voice. Found joy again. Found the permission to be a child even in a world that had tried to strip that from her. Her art became more than testimony. It became invitation etched on barn walls and fence posts, a record that something good had happened here. Their story is not about perfection. They argued, they grieved, they feared, but they stayed. And each time they chose to stay, to return to the fire, to share a meal, to carve a talisman or plant a seed, they redefined what safety meant. They turned from reaction to creation. They didn't erase the past, but they stopped letting it write their future. And the others came, not to witness a miracle, but to take part in it. Strangers became neighbors. Travelers found purpose. The broken remembered how to build. That's what community is, not an accident of geography, but a commitment to presence, to showing up, again and again. In the quiet circle, they did not become heroes. They became whole. And what does that mean for us here and now? In a world that feels increasingly fractured, where fear sells faster than truth, and silence is often mistaken for safety, what can we learn from three people who chose mercy over vengeance? First, that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's the man who lays down his rifle, the woman who brews tea instead of running, the girl who paints joy into places that only knew sorrow. Second, that healing takes time, and that time is made bearable only by company. You do not need to have the answers. You only need to stay long enough to ask the right questions. Third, that every garden planted in burned ground is an act of rebellion, a refusal to be defined by what was lost. Whether that garden is made of vegetables or words or kindness, it matters. And finally, that community is built not with grand gestures but with quiet ones. A meal shared, a story told, a fence post carved with a single word. So, if this story moved you, if you felt the heat of the fire, the stillness of the desert, the echo of voices long silenced, then carry it with you. Let it be a reminder that change doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it shows up with bare feet, a broken voice, and a question. Will you help me say yes? Help someone plant their garden. And if this story has stayed with you, if it's whispered something true into the quiet corners of your heart, then we ask you to stay with us. There are more stories coming. Stories that won't just entertain but remind us what it means to be human. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment about what part of Gideon, Luma, or Mira's journey struck you most. Share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Because in a world that often forgets, your presence here helps us remember. And that, dear friends, is how we build the next circle.